Hey guys, today we start with the most basic and yet most backbreaking part of Roman logistics, your feet. You've barely laced your sandals, those tough as leather caligae, before realizing the Romans treated marching as both an art form and a survival tactic. Imagine being told, "Congrats, you've joined the legions. Now, please walk 20 miles today with a full pack, and then build a fortified camp before dinner." You probably won't survive this. Most modern folks would collapse before the second mile, let alone the 20th. And yet, the Roman army expected it as routine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You trudge forward, iron-shod soles clacking on carefully laid stone roads. This isn't some dirt track. This is the Via Appia, the queen of roads, built so straight and solid you half wonder if the engineers were allergic to curves. Roman surveyors laid these highways with plumb lines and gromas, ensuring directness that would make Google Maps weep with envy. Every mile, there's a carved marker telling you how far you've gone. In modern terms, it's like the empire installed their own version of mileage apps, minus the battery drain. The historical fact you chew on as you march is this. Those roads were so durable that parts of them are still visible today, 2,000 years later, outlasting kingdoms, wars, and your favorite phone's warranty. That's the serious bit. The quirky tidbit, legionaries nicknamed their packs Marius mules after Gaius Marius, the general who decided soldiers should carry their own gear instead of relying on endless baggage trains. It made the army faster, tougher, and slightly grumpier, but at least nobody could complain about not getting their steps in. Your sandals slap rhythmically against the stones, and you start to notice the orderliness. Columns of soldiers moving with machine-like precision, shields slung on backs, spears angled like a forest of deadly twigs. It's less like an army and more like a human conveyor belt stretching across provinces. Historians still argue whether these long marches bonded soldiers with shared suffering or just made them all hate their centurions equally. Either way, discipline was non-negotiable. You slow down, you risk a whack with a vine staff. As dust rises around you, you imagine the sensory overload. Leather straps creaking, bronze fittings glinting in the sun, mules braying under loads of grain, and the occasional curse when someone trips over a stone. The Romans had this whole rhythm nailed down. Marching wasn't just transportation, it was psychological warfare. When villagers saw 10,000 men arrive in perfect step, it wasn't just scary. It was like watching a human freight train glide past their huts. You can't help but think, if FedEx could deliver with this consistency, maybe your online orders wouldn't get delayed. Even their rest stops were planned. Roman armies didn't just plop down at random. They had designated points, distances measured, water sources scouted ahead by surveyors and scouts. The result was like a touring rock band with logistics down to the last amphora of wine. And yes, wine was part of the equation. Because let's face it, even the toughest legionary didn't want to end the day with only water. As you keep trudging, sweat stinging your eyes, you realize how much this constant motion defined Rome's empire. Roads weren't just for war. They carried merchants, couriers, tax collectors, and gossip faster than any rival state could match. But for soldiers, it meant one simple truth. Wherever you went, you weren't just walking into enemy territory. You were extending Rome itself, one sandal print at a time. And just when you think you can't take another step, your centurion yells, "Camp time," which, spoiler alert, doesn't mean rest. It means construction duty. But that's for later. You still need to survive the march. Your stomach growls before the centurion even opens his mouth, because here's the dirty truth. An army marches on its stomach. You can have the best sandals, the straightest roads, even the scariest Eagle standard gleaming in the sunlight. But if you don't have food, you're not conquering Gaul, you're just inventing the first Mediterranean weight loss camp. And the Romans knew this better than anyone. So we eat on campaign. Spoiler, it's not a Caesar salad. Instead, you're issued a ration of grain, usually wheat. Not bread, raw grain. Why? Because the Romans decided you, the soldier, should be a mobile bakery. In your pack, you lug around a hand mill, 2 heavy stones that you grind together every evening to crush kernels into flour. Then you mix that flour with water, slap it on a hot stone or pan, and voila, a dense, chewy flatbread that tastes like ambition mixed with regret. Alongside grain, the army stocked other essentials: salted pork, bacon, cheese, vinegar, mixed with water into a drink called pasca, and occasionally dried fruit. And then there's garum, the infamous Roman fish sauce. Imagine a barrel of anchovies left to rot in the sun until it liquefies into a pungent brown juice. Romans poured this on everything, claiming it added flavor. You suspect it mostly added smell. Soldiers carried little jars of it, like ancient ketchup packets, dousing their bland bread with what can only be described as ocean and decay. But logistics weren't just about what you could carry. The empire had entire supply chains stretching back to farms and storehouses. Grain ships sailed from Egypt and North Africa to fill granaries in Rome, while provincial depots stocked reserves for legions. This was industrial food service before anyone invented cafeterias. If you're picturing a legionary supply depot, imagine Costco, but with more spears leaning against the walls. Here's a historical fact to chew on. One legion of about 5,000 men consumed roughly 27 tons of grain every month. That's like feeding an entire small town, just so soldiers can keep marching. Now the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers apparently developed a taste for bacon so strong that their commanders worried about supply shortages. Not because of enemy raids, but because men hoarded slabs of pork like it was treasure. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Rome's supply system was centrally coordinated from the top down, or if local commanders just improvised, raiding farms and squeezing provinces whenever rations ran low. As you bite into your chunk of bread, dry enough to scratch your throat, you realize food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. Imagine trudging 20 miles and then discovering the bacon shipment didn't arrive. That's how mutinies started. Smart generals sweetened the pot with wine rations, sometimes distributed after tough marches. Others promised double meat rations before battles to pump soldiers up. Food wasn't just logistics, it was psychology. The sensory reality hits you. The smell of roasting meat when supply wagons actually deliver, the sour tang of pasca on your tongue, the crunch of hard bread in your teeth. You glance around and see your comrades gnawing hunks of pork fat, laughing at bad jokes, or muttering curses about the cook. In that moment, the Roman army feels less like a machine and more like a traveling frat house powered by carbs and salt. You can't help but chuckle at the thought. Today, athletes have protein shakes, legionaries had bread rocks and fish juice. And just like your modern gym buddy who won't stop talking about macros, Roman soldiers were obsessed with their rations too. Without food, the empire's war machine grinds to a halt. With it, you've got a relentless force fueled by grain mills and pork bellies, marching forward, belly full enough to swing a sword tomorrow. Your sandals scrape the stones again, but this time you look down with new appreciation. These roads aren't just a nice bonus. They're the backbone of Rome's logistical genius. You realize every single step you take has been calculated, surveyed, and locked into a network so massive that at its peak, it stretched more than 250,000 miles. That's basically the Roman version of Wi-Fi coverage, except instead of buffering videos, it buffered legions with grain and reinforcements. Roman engineers had a knack for turning landscapes into straight lines. Their secret weapon was the groma, a simple surveying tool with cross-shaped arms and dangling plumb lines. With it, they plotted perfectly straight stretches across hills, valleys, even swamps. Romans weren't allergic to detours. They just hated them. If a mountain stood in the way, they cut through it. If a swamp got soggy, they drained it. Imagine your GPS refusing to reroute. Instead, it just bulldozes a new highway through your neighbor's living room. And building the roads? That was a full-body workout. Layers upon layers, big stones at the bottom, gravel and sand in the middle, then fitted paving slabs on top. Soldiers, locals, and conscripted laborers all hacked, hauled, and hammered these roads into place. The result was a highway system durable enough that, yes, buses in modern Italy still drive over them. That's right, 2,000-year-old infrastructure is holding up better than some modern pothole-ridden asphalt you've cursed at this week. Here's the serious historical fact. Roads weren't just for marching armies. They carried couriers with messages, merchants hauling amphorae of wine, tax collectors demanding tribute, and administrators dragging stacks of wax tablets. In fact, Rome established way stations every 12 to 15 miles where fresh horses were kept for couriers. You could, theoretically, send a message across the empire at about 50 miles per day. The quirky tidbit: those mile markers you keep passing weren't just distance signs. They sometimes included trivia like who built the road, or cheeky boasts from emperors claiming credit. Kind of like the ancient world's version of politicians slapping their names on bridges. But here's the debate that still rattles scholars. Was Rome's road system primarily built for war or for trade? Some argue the military utility was the top priority. After all, roads allowed legions to stomp down rebellions quickly. Others insist that trade benefited so much it's impossible to separate the two. You, trudging along with a pack heavier than your cousin after Thanksgiving dinner, probably don't care. You just know the road keeps you from sinking knee-deep into mud. Marching along, you notice the side effects. Merchants setting up stalls near junctions, kids running barefoot along the paving stones, priests hauling statues to the next festival. The roads became arteries not just of war, but of culture. Without them, Rome might have stayed an Italian powerhouse. With them, it became a continental overlord. You pause at a rest point where a milestone stands tall. The sun has baked it white, its Latin letters chipped but proud. You read aloud. To Rome, 212 miles. And you suddenly understand the psychological trick. No matter where you are, the milestone whispers, Rome is here. Rome is everywhere. Every march feels less like wandering and more like extending invisible threads that tie you back to the capital. Still, humor creeps in. Picture the poor guy in charge of road maintenance. Every time a paving slab cracked, some official probably muttered, "Better fix that. The emperor might be marching through next week." And of course, the soldiers joked about the roads too, especially the parts that felt like walking across jagged cobblestones designed by someone with a grudge against feet. By the time dusk falls, you get it. Without roads, no grain arrives, no reinforcements march, no empire stands. They weren't just stone, they were strategy, propaganda, and psychological glue. As your sore feet throb, you mutter that at least your sandals have iron hobnails. Small comfort, sure, but better than tripping through mud. By now your legs are jelly, your shoulders ache from hauling half a kitchen on your back, and you think the day is finally over. Wrong. You've just arrived at the campsite, and surprise, rest doesn't exist in the Roman army. The order is barked out, stakes are slammed into the ground, and suddenly the legion transforms into the world's fastest pop-up city. First, the tents. Each contubernium, a squad of 8 soldiers, shares one leather tent. Imagine a giant, awkwardly folded tarp stitched from cowhide, smelling faintly like a barn and heavier than your entire gym set. You and your 7 tent mates set it up together, cursing the poles, tripping over ropes, and pretending you know which flap goes where. If IKEA ever sold these, the instruction booklet would simply say, "Good luck, soldier." Then come the latrines. Yes, the Romans were pioneers of military hygiene, and you're grateful, sort of. Trenches are dug at the edge of camp, lined neatly, because discipline extends even to bodily functions. Soldiers joke that you can tell the quality of a legion by the straightness of its latrine row. And trust me, after a few days of salted pork and garum, those trenches become battlefields in their own right. As night falls, the camp fills with the glow of torches and the thrum of routine. The main street, the Via Principalis, runs between 2 gates. The headquarters tent, the Praetorium, sits in the center like the heart of a body. Everything is organized with mathematical precision. Barracks here, stables there, workshops and kitchens placed exactly where regulations demand. If you're plopped into any Roman camp blindfolded, you'd still know where the mess area is. Now, the camp's beating soul, the standards. Each legion carries an eagle standard, the Aquila. Soldiers salute it like a divine presence. Lose the eagle in battle, and you might as well book a one-way ticket to Disgrace City. Here's your historical fact. In 53 BCE, Crassus lost several eagles to the Parthians at Carrhae, and Rome obsessed over recovering them for decades, treating it like avenging a national humiliation. The quirky tidbit: standards weren't just eagles. Some units had hands, dragons, or bore figures at the top of poles. Imagine marching into war under a giant golden hand, giving everyone the world's oldest thumbs up. But here's where historians still argue. Was the Roman camp truly a symbol of discipline, or was it more about psychological comfort? Some say the neat, grid layout reminded soldiers of Roman towns, giving them a sense of home wherever they went. Others argue it was purely practical. Order meant safety, especially if enemies attacked at night. You, while hammering tent stakes, don't care. You just know the routine, make sure nobody sleeps in the wrong spot, and steals your spot in the latrine line tomorrow morning. The sensory overload of camp life hits you quickly. The smell of smoke from dozens of cooking fires, the clank of armor being repaired, the sound of dice rolling as soldiers gamble away tomorrow's bread. Somewhere nearby, a mule brays in protest while someone tries to yank another load of supplies off its back. And over it all, the ever-watchful officers patrol, vine staffs ready for anyone slacking off. You catch a glimpse of your comrades, polishing the standard before propping it in its place of honor. It gleams in the firelight, casting long shadows that make the camp seem more like a sacred ritual site than a temporary fortress. You realize that in this tight grid of tents and trenches, Rome isn't just practicing war. It's rehearsing civilization, even in enemy territory. Finally, when you collapse on your blanket, you whisper a thank you that at least your tent mates are snoring in sync. The eagle's standard gleams faintly outside, reminding you, no matter how tired you are, tomorrow morning you'll pack all this up, march another 20 miles, and build it again. Congratulations. You're now part of the most exhausting Airbnb franchise in history. You wake up sore, and before you can rub the sleep from your eyes, you hear the groans of camp animals. Welcome to the real muscle of Roman logistics, the walking, braying, mooing transport fleet. You might think the legion itself is the unstoppable engine, but truth is, without mules, wagons, and ox carts, the whole machine stalls like a chariot with square wheels. Take the mule, for instance. Soldiers half-jokingly, half-bitterly called themselves Marius mules, but the actual mules were the unsung heroes. Stronger than donkeys, less stubborn than horses, they hauled everything from cooking pots to sacks of grain to spare shields. Each coturbanium often had a pack mule assigned, and if you've ever tried loading one, you'll know they come with opinions. One kicks, another refuses to budge, and a third seems intent on eating your sandal straps. Still, the Romans swore by them, calling them the most reliable four-legged soldiers in the ranks. Then there were wagons, wooden monsters with iron fittings, creaking and groaning under the weight of siege equipment, barrels of wine, and sometimes even extra weapons. They needed oxen to pull them, which meant slow, steady movement, like ancient armor trucks with no speed setting higher than plod. But oxen had stamina, chewing cud as they trudged forward, unimpressed by terrain that would reduce a horse to tears. Here's your historical fact. Julius Caesar, during the Gallic Wars, kept his supply lines moving with an endless stream of wagons carrying food, tents, and even portable forges. He was so obsessed with keeping them safe that he often fortified his marching columns, surrounding wagons with troops to fend off ambushes. The quirky tidbit: some wagons doubled as mobile kitchens, fitted with racks to hang pots and pans so the army could cook even on the move. Picture a Roman version of a food truck, minus the cheerful branding. And here's where historians still argue. Were Roman supply animals primarily state-provided, or did soldiers and officers supply their own? Some sources suggest wealthy officers maintained private baggage trains, while ordinary soldiers had to manage with shared animals. Others think the empire itself organized it, sending out requisition officers to seize livestock from unlucky villagers. Either way, you're grateful when a mule shows up carrying your load instead of you carrying it. But this logistical zoo came with problems. Animals needed food and water, too, tons of it. A single ox could eat 20 pounds of fodder a day, meaning supply chains had to feed their own supply chains. And animals get sick, break legs, or simply collapse mid-march. Soldiers joked about eating their pack mule after a hard day, and sometimes they weren't joking. If the baggage animals failed, the legion slowed, morale dipped, and the Empire's vaunted efficiency suddenly looked a lot more like chaos. The sensory experience is unforgettable. The constant creak of wagon wheels, the smell of sweaty hides, the rhythmic thud of hooves on stone. Dust rises as a column of animals stretches behind you, carrying Rome's war chest into the horizon. And in the middle of it all, some poor soldier is tasked with baggage guard, trudging alongside, ready to swat thieves or stab an opportunistic barbarian raider. Not glamorous, but vital. Sometimes the baggage train stretched so long it looked like a moving village. Traders and camp followers often tagged along, hoping to profit from hungry, bored soldiers. Somewhere near the rear, a blacksmith's portable forge might clang, while kids belonging to camp followers scurry between carts. Rome wasn't just moving an army, it was dragging an entire ecosystem. As you watch a particularly grumpy mule buck its load into the dirt, you can't help but laugh. The Empire might have conquered half the known world, but still relied on stubborn animals that thought with their stomachs. Logistics, you realize, wasn't just about brilliance. It was about patience, manure, and hoping the ox doesn't sit down in the middle of a river crossing. You've marched, eaten, pitched tents, and wrangled mules. Now comes something far less glamorous, but every bit as critical: paperwork. Yes, even the deadliest empire in the ancient world ran on lists, tallies, and wax tablets. Welcome to the Roman army's real battlefield, the accountant's bench. Picture it. While you're grinding grain into bread or polishing armor, somewhere nearby a clerk is hunched over a wooden tablet covered in beeswax, scribbling away with a stylus. These clerks weren't the heroes of Hollywood, but they were the heroes of logistics. They tracked rations, wages, equipment, weapons, and even the number of nails issued for repairs. Lose your sword? It's recorded. Break your tent pole? Recorded. Forget to return a cooking pot? Oh, that's going on your permanent record. Soldier. Here's your historical fact. Roman military administration was so detailed that we still have surviving papyri and inscriptions listing pay, deductions, and supply inventories. Some show that soldiers were docked wages for things like food or boots, leaving them with shockingly little take-home pay. The quirky tidbit: clerks sometimes wrote jokes or doodles in margins. Little cartoons of soldiers or scribbled insults about their commanders, the ancient version of office humor. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these detailed records meant Rome had a centralized bureaucracy micromanaging everything, or whether paperwork was more local, handled case by legions in the field. Either way, you feel the weight of bureaucracy pressing on your shoulders as much as your shield. The process was elaborate. Food issued, tallied. Animals lost, tallied. Weapons distributed, tallied. It was like running a giant spreadsheet, except instead of formulas, you had a wax tablet you could wipe clean and reuse. Don't be fooled by the simplicity. Those numbers kept the legion alive. One missing shipment of grain could mean hunger. One missing delivery of javelins could mean defeat. And if something didn't add up, officers demanded explanations with the kind of glare that makes your stomach flip faster than spoiled garum. The sensory picture is almost comical. Imagine the clang and clatter of camp life, the shouting of officers, the braying of mules. Yet in the corner, a clerk calmly scratches away at his tablet like he's back in a quiet library. Every now and then, he heats the wax to smooth it, erasing mistakes with a little puff of smoke. The smell of beeswax mixes with the smell of sweat and leather, a bizarre perfume of empire. But paperwork wasn't only about supplies. It also tracked manpower. Roll calls were conducted with strict attention, names and details recorded. Promotions, punishments, and decorations were etched into records. If you ever wondered why Rome could shuffle legions like chess pieces across continents, this was why. They knew exactly who and what they had at all times. The army wasn't just muscle, it was data. Humor sneaks in when you realize how universal this is. Soldiers grumbled about paperwork in 50 BCE, just like office workers do today. You can almost hear a legionary muttering, "Why do I have to sign for my own spear? I just used it yesterday." Or, "Great, I survived battle, but now I have to file a broken sandal form." Bureaucracy, the one enemy Rome never conquered. Still, you can't deny its effectiveness. With numbers etched and supplies accounted for, the empire could march into Gaul, Egypt, or Britannia knowing what it had in the tank. Paperwork wasn't glamorous, but without it, campaigns would crumble. You're tempted to laugh at the thought that the fate of Rome might rest on a guy scratching wax tablets. But in truth, it often did. And as you sling your pack for tomorrow's march, you realize the soldier fights with sword and shield, but the empire conquers with ink and wax. Just when you think your day can't get busier, the order comes down: build the camp. Again, you sigh, grab your shovel, and realize this isn't a campsite. It's the Roman military's version of erecting a mini fortress every single night. Welcome to the greatest pop-up architecture show the world has ever seen. The process starts with marking out the perimeter. Surveyors stride ahead with measuring rods and gromas, planting stakes with mathematical precision. This isn't random. Every legionary camp, whether in Spain, Britain, or Syria, followed the same grid plan. Ditches are dug, ramparts raised, and wooden stakes hammered into palisades. Within hours, what looked like a plain field transforms into something that would make city planners drool. Imagine if your camping trip required building a suburb before roasting marshmallows. You and your squad get assigned to ditch duty. With picks and spades, you carve a defensive trench around the perimeter, piling up the earth into a mound for extra height. The sweat stings your eyes, the dirt cakes under your nails, and you realize this isn't optional. Every single soldier contributes. Even officers sometimes pitch in to set an example. Though conveniently, they often end up with lighter tasks like marking lines. Typical. Here's your historical fact. Julius Caesar's commentaries describe how his legions could throw up a fully fortified camp in a single evening, complete with ditches, walls, and gates. That speed and uniformity terrified opponents. Barbarians saw not just soldiers, but engineers who turned any meadow into a fortress. The quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found remnants of Roman camps so consistent in design that you could drop a Lego kit on the outline and it would fit perfectly. Some soldiers even carved their initials into wooden stakes before planting them, like signing their work. And here's the debate. Historians still argue whether the discipline of nightly camp building was purely practical or also psychological warfare. Was it just about safety, or did Rome deliberately want enemies to see a fortress rise out of nowhere? Imagine being a tribal warrior watching 10,000 men build a city overnight. It's like watching your opponent casually set up a castle while you're still sharpening sticks. Inside the camp, streets are laid out neatly. The Via Principalis runs between gates, leading to the Praetorium in the center. Barracks line up in rows, stables are positioned for easy access, and workshops buzz with activity. Kitchens spring up with makeshift ovens, sending out smells of bread and roasting meat that make your stomach growl even louder than the mules. The sensory overload is staggering. The rhythmic thud of hammers driving stakes, the scrape of shovels in gravel, officers shouting orders like an orchestra conductor of chaos. Torches flare as dusk falls, and suddenly the outline of a miniature city glows against the dark countryside. You wipe the grime from your forehead and admit, there's something awe-inspiring about the order of it all. And then the jokes start. Soldiers tease each other about ditch-digging technique. That's not a trench, that's a puddle. Or complain that their palisade wall looks like it was built by blind goats. You even overhear someone grumble, "We conquer half the world, but apparently also every pile of dirt in it." Still, beneath the sarcasm lies pride. Everyone knows this nightly labor keeps you alive when raiders test the camp at night. Finally, when the palisades are up and the gates set, guard are posted. The fortress hums with life. Gamblers roll dice, smiths hammer repairs, cooks stir pots. And you collapse in your tent, body aching but strangely reassured. Because no matter how far from Rome you are, this orderly fortress feels like a piece of the empire planted in foreign soil. You drift off thinking, tomorrow you'll tear it down, march on, and build it again. Rome's true superpower wasn't just swords or roads. It was the ability to make civilization rise from nothing, night after night, one ditch at a time. The next morning, as the camp is dismantled and the mules are loaded again, you find yourself staring at a wide river. Marching on stone roads is one thing, but here you realize Rome's logistical genius didn't stop at dry land. They mastered rivers, lakes, and seas with the same cold efficiency. Welcome aboard. Whether you can swim or not, you're now part of Rome's floating supply chain. First comes the river crossing. Engineers get to work lashing boats together into temporary bridges or throwing pontoons across the current. Soldiers haul planks, lash ropes, and before you know it, an entire army is marching across water as if Neptune himself signed a building permit. You grip the handrail nervously, imagining what happens if a mule panics mid-bridge. Spoiler, sometimes they did, and there were splashy consequences. But rivers weren't just obstacles, they were highways. Barges and flat-bottomed boats carried grain, weapons, even siege engines. Imagine a convoy of floating wagons drifting downriver, guarded by soldiers on the banks. The creak of wood and slap of water replaces the endless crunch of boots on stone. The Romans didn't see rivers as barriers. They saw them as conveyor belts. Here's your historical fact. Augustus established the classis, permanent naval fleets stationed across the empire, from the Mediterranean to the Rhine and Danube. They didn't just fight pirates. They hauled supplies, ferried troops, and ensured Rome's armies could campaign far from home. The quirky tidbit: some of these supply ships were so big they carried live animals, including war elephants. Yes, imagine sharing deck space with a seasick elephant. Good luck with that smell. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Rome's logistics leaned more on its navy than on roads. Was the Mediterranean truly a Roman lake because fleets ferried everything cheaply by sea, or were roads the real arteries? Likely both, but as you sway on this barge, you appreciate water's efficiency. A single ship could carry what dozens of wagons hauled. The only downside? Seasickness. The sensory details crash into you. The sharp tang of salt, the creak of rigging, the splash of oars. Seagulls squawk overhead, while soldiers grumble about cramped quarters and stale biscuits. Somewhere, a mule brays from below deck, reminding you that Rome's animal companions did not enjoy sea voyages. Wine barrels roll with every wave, and you pray the corks hold, because nothing kills morale faster than spilled booze. Logistical genius meant thinking ahead. Harbors were fortified. Lighthouses like the one at Alexandria guided ships, and coastal depots stored supplies ready for pickup. Some generals even built fleets on the spot. Julius Caesar once ordered ships constructed inland, dragged them to rivers, and shocked enemies with a sudden navy that appeared out of nowhere. That's the Roman spirit. Why walk around the obstacle when you can build a boat and float through it? Of course, humor creeps in. Soldiers joked about drowning in their armor or prayed their centurion couldn't swim, because if he goes down, we're all free. Others teased that Rome would conquer Neptune next, given enough timber and nails. You laugh, but as the barge rocks, you cling tighter to the railing. Logistics may be brilliant, but it's still at the mercy of the waves. By evening, the fleet docks at a makeshift landing. Supplies are unloaded with military rhythm. Grain sacks slung ashore, weapons stacked, carts reassembled. The army reforms as if nothing unusual happened. You step on a dry land, knees shaky, grateful to feel solid earth again. Behind you, the river flows on, a reminder that Rome's empire didn't just march across continents. It sailed, floated, and wrote itself into history. And as you shuffle back in a line, you mutter, If Rome ever invents inflatables, we're all doomed to paddle across every puddle between here and Britannia. Your boots have barely dried from the river crossing when a new sound fills the air. Clang, clang, clang. Sparks burst in the twilight, and you realize you've stumbled into the lifeblood of Roman warfare, the mobile workshops. Forget blacksmiths tucked away in sleepy villages. Rome brought the forge on the road. Picture a cluster of smiths bent over anvils, hammers rising and falling in rhythm, molten iron spitting like angry fireflies. Portable bellows puff life into makeshift furnaces, and the air smells of charcoal and hot metal. You wander closer, half blinded by the glow, and there it is, the Empire's weapons factory, churning out pila, swords, helmets, and nails by the thousands. Logistics wasn't just about moving supplies, it was about producing them wherever the legions marched. Here's your historical fact. Roman armies carried prefabricated parts for siege engines, like ballistae and catapults, which could be assembled on-site by craftsmen. This meant no waiting months for delivery. The battlefield itself became a weapons lab. The quirky tidbit: soldiers sometimes asked smiths to forge trinkets or personalized gear, rings, decorated belt buckles, or dice for gambling. Imagine a blacksmith, in between making spearheads, hammering out a lucky charm because Marcus in tent number 3 refuses to fight without his magic token. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue about how self-sufficient these field workshops really were. Some say they could produce nearly everything a legion needed, from arrowheads to repairs on armor. Others argue the big stuff, like high-quality blades, still came from permanent centers in places like Gaul or Hispania, with field smiths doing quick fixes and improvisations. Either way, the hammer blows around you prove one thing. Rome never waited for Amazon Prime. They brought Amazon with them. The sensory experience is overwhelming. Sparks sting your cheeks, the heat makes your eyes water, and the constant rhythm of hammers turns into a metallic heartbeat echoing through camp. The clang of a sword test rings out, sharp, clean, terrifying. You realize how much of Rome's power lay not just in men, but in this endless rhythm of creation and repair. Even armor needed constant work. A dented helmet? Rehammered. A chainmail link snapped? Rewoven on the spot. The smiths moved through camp like rock stars, respected by soldiers who depended on their skill. You overhear jokes, "Don't upset the smith," where your sword might bend in battle. You laugh, but a tiny part of you wonders how much truth lies in that. The workshops also built the heavy toys, siege engines. Imagine the chaos. Beams of timber being shaved and joined, ropes twisted into torsion springs, iron fittings forged to hold it all together. By the time morning came, a catapult could be assembled, locked, and ready to fling stones at some unlucky enemy fort. Soldiers must have found it surreal. March all day, build camp at night, and then help construct a war machine taller than your tent. And humor? Soldiers complained that smiths always smelled of smoke and sweat, no matter how much garum they splashed on themselves. Others joked that smiths were half magicians, half demons, turning rock into weapons. If Vulcan himself walked into camp, one soldier mutters he just asked for a job. As you watch sparks fly into the night sky, you realize Rome's true power wasn't just conquering, it was adapting. Roads carried armies, rivers carried supplies, but these workshops carried the empire's beating heart of iron. The clang of the hammer was as Roman as the eagle's standard, a sound that promised tomorrow's fight would be armed, armored, and ready. You rub a speck of soot from your face, yawn, and trudge back to your tent. Somewhere behind you, a smith keeps hammering, his rhythm steady, sparks leaping higher than the stars. Rome never sleeps. Not when there's iron to bend and empires to forge. You don't get far into your next day's march before the reality of warfare hits you square in the shin. Not a blade, not an arrow, just a pebble in your sandal. But when you trip into camp, muttering curses, the nearest medic eyes you like you've just been skewered by a spear. Welcome to the medical tents of a Roman army, where stubbed toes and life-threatening wounds lined up side by side. Picture a row of canvas shelters smelling faintly of vinegar, honey, and sweat. Inside, assistants, orderlies called capsarii, bustle about with bandages, knives, and bowls of strange pastes. Roman medicine was shockingly advanced for its time. They carried surgical tools like forceps, scalpels, and even early bone saws. Here's your solid historical fact. The Roman legions often traveled with medici, trained doctors who could amputate limbs, stitch wounds, and cauterize gashes with red-hot iron. The soldiers hated that last part, by the way. Quirky tidbit: Romans believed spider webs made good bandages. Yes, actual cobwebs were pressed onto wounds because they supposedly stopped bleeding and helped clotting. You can imagine a legionary mid-battle yelling, "Quick, find me a spider." Not exactly the heroic image marble statues give us. But historians still argue whether Roman field medicine genuinely increased survival rates compared to other ancient armies. Some say their structured approach, dedicated medics, organized hospitals, and a surprising knowledge of antiseptics saved countless lives. Others insist infection remained the real enemy, with luck and the gods deciding survival more than skill. The debate rages like a fever the medics could never quite cure. As you limp inside the tent, the sensory overload almost knocks you over. The air is thick with incense smoke, meant to ward off bad spirits. A soldier groans as a doctor presses a heated iron onto a wound. The smell is equal parts barbecue and horror. Another is fed wine until he passes out, a crude but effective anesthesia. You gag, but a medic pats your shoulder. "Don't worry, you'll be fine." Pebbles rarely kill. Medical tents weren't just for wounds. They handled diseases too. Dysentery ran rampant in close quarters, and the medics worked overtime with herbal remedies like garlic and vinegar mixtures. Imagine chugging that instead of Gatorade. A soldier nearby clutches his stomach, groaning, and you realize the Roman Empire's greatest threat might not have been Carthage, but questionable camp cooking. And yet, despite the grimness, there's a strange comfort here. The Romans built valetinaria, field hospitals, at permanent forts. Some were designed with separate wards, drainage systems, and even surgical rooms. It wasn't modern healthcare, but it was light years ahead of many medieval armies who later just let soldiers rot. Of course, humor thrived even here. You overhear one soldier bragging that his scar will make him irresistible in Rome's taverns. Another moans dramatically, only to be diagnosed with too much wine and sent back to duty with a jug of water and a kick in the rear. You notice soldiers bonding here, too. Comrades sat with the wounded, held hands during surgery, or shared jokes while bandages were changed. Morale was as important as medicine, and nothing said brotherhood like laughing at your friend's lopsided haircut after the barber doubled as a surgeon. By the time you leave the tent, your shin pebble feels embarrassingly minor. Still, you can't shake the thought. Armies win battles not just with swords, but with bandages. Rome's ability to patch soldiers up and shove them back into formation kept legions functioning long after other armies would have crumbled. The medic waves you off with a smile. Next time, try sandals without holes. You roll your eyes, but deep down, you're grateful. Because in Rome, even the smallest pebble could become a full-blown war if logistics didn't include the healers. You shuffle away from the medical tent only to be stopped by a grizzled centurion who slaps you on the shoulder and growls, "Time to learn about gods, boy." You quickly discover that Roman logistics weren't just about wagons and water skins. They carried a heavy load of religion, too. Every campaign marched under divine watch, and you couldn't sharpen a sword without someone muttering a prayer first. Fact first, before setting out on any military expedition, Roman generals performed sacrifices to Jupiter, Mars, and other gods, hoping for a favorable omen. Chickens were a favorite. Sacred chickens were fed, and if they ate greedily, the army rejoiced. If they refused, that spelled disaster. One Roman commander famously hurled the chickens into the sea when they wouldn't eat, snarling, "If they won't eat, let them drink." Spoiler, he lost the battle. Here's your quirky tidbit. Soldiers carried lucky charms like phallic amulets, believed to ward off evil. Imagine thousands of men armed not just with gladii, but also dangling little bronze willies under their tunics for protection. You'd think Mars himself would be embarrassed. Historians still argue whether religion genuinely influenced morale or was just a top-down way to control soldiers. Did the men really believe Jupiter decided the outcome of every skirmish? Or did they just find comfort in ritual when the odds were terrifying? The truth may be both. Faith and omens made the chaos of war feel slightly more predictable. As the sun sets, you watch priests, pontifices slaughter sheep, inspecting entrails for signs. The smell of blood and burning fat mixes with incense, creating a bizarre perfume that clings to your nose. Soldiers gather, eyes wide, awaiting the verdict. The priest frowns, then nods. The gods approve. A collective sigh ripples through the ranks, louder than any war trumpet. But divine logistics didn't stop at rituals. Roman camps had altars built on-site, often dedicated to Mars or local deities adopted from conquered lands. Soldiers prayed before battle and gave thanks afterward. Even spoils of war were divided with ritual. Offerings were set aside for the gods first, before anyone touched their share of gold or wine. And of course, superstition thrived. Soldiers avoided unlucky days, refused to march if thunderstruck at the wrong moment, and clung to prophecies like tick-tock horoscopes. You overhear a group debating whether seeing a raven before breakfast means triumph or doom. One soldier insists it's a good sign, while another mutters that it means there'll be breakfast. The rituals built camaraderie too. Picture a legion huddled together, chanting hymns, their voices rumbling like a distant storm. Even the most skeptical soldier likely felt comfort in being part of something bigger than himself. For men far from home, faith was another supply line, delivering hope instead of bread. And just like food or water, hope had to be rationed carefully. Too much superstition could cripple an army. You can almost hear the whispers, "The omens are bad. Maybe we should stay in camp." That's when commanders leaned on ritual like a hammer, declaring the gods were smiling, whether or not the chickens agreed. Walking back through camp, you notice small shrines outside tents. Some men pray to Jupiter, others to Mercury, and a few to Mithras, whose cult spread like wildfire among legionaries. A centurion invites you to peek into a dim, cave-like shrine where initiates reenact a bull-slaying myth. You politely decline, mostly because the smell of burnt offerings has already turned your stomach. The night closes in, and you lie awake listening to murmurs, soldiers whispering prayers, muttering charms, clutching talismans. You realize Roman warfare wasn't just fought with iron, it was fought with faith. And sometimes, you suspect, believing the gods were on your side mattered as much as the sharpness of your sword. You wake to the sound of horns, not signaling battle, but breakfast. Turns out feeding thousands of soldiers isn't as simple as tossing them bread and calling it a day. You drag yourself to the mess lines and discover another marvel of Roman logistics. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was carefully calculated fuel. Roman soldiers ate a surprisingly balanced diet for men constantly on the move. Grain was the backbone. Each legionary carried about 3 days' worth of wheat in his pack, grinding it into porridge or flatbread when camp was set. Add a bit of bacon, cheese, or lentils, and you've got dinner. Not Michelin star quality, but hey, at least no one's starving. Here's your quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes flavored their meals with garum, a fermented fish sauce beloved across the empire. Imagine fish guts left to rot in the sun until they liquefy, then poured over everything like ketchup. Delicious or horrifying, depending on your nose. Some archaeologists claim amphorae of garum traveled almost as far as the legions themselves, which proves one thing. You can take Rome out of the kitchen, but you can't take the kitchen out of Rome. Historians still argue whether Roman supply officers prioritized calorie count or morale when planning rations. Did commanders care about balanced diets? Or did they just shovel whatever they could get into sacks and hope nobody keeled over? Given the empire's obsession with efficiency, maybe it was both. Food kept soldiers alive, but tasty food kept them willing to fight another day. Camps had bakeries, too. Excavations at Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall show that ovens were as essential as barracks. The smell of fresh bread, drifting over a fortress of timber and stone, could do wonders for spirits. You notice soldiers joking about whose loaf baked best, their laughter bubbling louder than any marching drum. But feeding a legion wasn't just about bread. Supply chains carried dried fruit, olives, wine, and even honey. When stationed abroad, soldiers sampled local produce, mixing Roman staples with whatever they could scavenge or purchase. In Gaul, it might be mead and boar. In Judea, figs and pomegranates. The empire's appetite was as wide as its borders. Of course, food had to be rationed with discipline. Quartermasters kept meticulous tallies of grain sacks, and punishment for hoarding was brutal. You hear about one unlucky soul caught sneaking extra rations. His punishment wasn't death, but worse, latrine duty for a month. Trust me, you'd rather take the sword. Meals themselves were as much ritual as nutrition. Soldiers sat in groups, eating together, building camaraderie spoonful by spoonful. They sang, they gambled with dice between bites, they swapped stories about home. A legion that eats together fights together. It's a cliche now, but the Romans invented it. And just as with water or roads, food moved with astonishing organization. Wagons loaded with grain followed armies, guarded as carefully as gold. You watch a convoy rumble into camp, oxen snorting, wheels creaking. Men cheer, not for reinforcements, but for dinner arriving on time. Truly, nothing wins loyalty like a hot meal. Yet hunger was a constant threat. If supply lines broke, soldiers foraged ruthlessly, stripping fields bare, seizing livestock, even raiding local villages. For the Romans, logistics was survival. Fail to feed the men, and the greatest empire in the world could crumble in days. As you chew on a surprisingly chewy loaf of barley bread, you realize food wasn't just calories, it was strategy. Armies moved at the pace of their stomachs. Caesar himself once wrote that logistics was more important than bravery. After all, courage fades on an empty stomach, but porridge keeps marching. By the end of breakfast, you're still hungry. The soldier next to you offers a taste of his garum-soaked bread. You smile weakly, then decline because honestly, the smell alone could knock over a war elephant. You think you're clever for dodging that garum bread, but the day's not done with you. The Legion is on the march again, and today's marvel isn't about food or tents. It's about keeping track of all the moving pieces. Imagine trying to run a corporation with no email, no Slack, not even sticky notes. Yet somehow Rome pulled it off. Enter the world of Roman record-keeping and pay chests. Every legion kept detailed rolls. Who enlisted, who died, who owed fines for breaking formation last Tuesday. Clerks known as librarii scribbled furiously on wax tablets, later transferring notes onto papyrus or parchment. You'd think all this paper pushing would slow down an army, but it actually made the legions hum like clockwork. Mainstream fact, Roman soldiers were paid in denarii, a silver coin that jingled heavily in leather pouches. Paydays came 3 times a year, though deductions for food, equipment, and uniforms often left the average soldier grumbling. One historian even joked the empire invented military payroll deductions before modern HR departments did. You can almost hear the complaints echo across centuries. Wait, where did half my pay go? Quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes carve graffiti about their wages onto walls, venting frustrations in the world's first recorded complaints department. Archaeologists at Pompeii have found scribbles mocking stingy paymasters or celebrating payday with crude drawings of overflowing wine jars. Apparently, complaining about bosses has always been universal. Historians still argue whether soldiers were truly motivated by money or if pay was just a token of Rome's promise to care for them. Was it cash that kept them marching, or the prestige, the land grants, the sense of belonging to something eternal? The debate lingers like a shadow over every ledger. And speaking of ledgers, the pay chest itself was treated like sacred treasure. It wasn't just coins, it symbolized the heart of a legion's trust. Losing it meant mutiny. That's why guards hovered over it like hawks, and why commanders planned routes with the chest's safety in mind. You picture a wooden chest bound in iron, carried in a guarded wagon, bouncing over Roman roads. It's not flashy, but without it, discipline would collapse faster than an undercooked bread loaf. Of course, not all record-keeping was about pay. Marching orders, supply tallies, medical rosters, everything was logged. Imagine a general screaming, "Where's my grain?" and some clerk flipping through wax tablets like a frazzled intern hunting for an Excel file. Humor aside, this paperwork kept tens of thousands of men organized in a world where chaos lurked behind every hill. As you trudge along, you overhear soldiers gossiping about a comrade fined for losing his helmet. Another one was dock pay for slacking on ditch duty. Discipline wasn't just enforced by the stick, it was carefully managed by the purse. Keep your gear, keep your pay, slack off, and watch your wages vanish. Brutal, but effective. Then there's the matter of bonuses. Victorious campaigns brought donatives, extra pay straight from the emperor's coffers. That's when soldiers really cheered. Forget medals. Give a legionary a heavy purse of silver, and you'll have loyalty that no speech could buy. You imagine payday on campaign. Men roaring in joy, tossing coins in the air, promising wine, women, and maybe a new cloak to show off. But with every coin comes paperwork. Someone had to count, tally, and sign off. The Roman solution? Multiple officials overseeing the chest, so no single person could run off with it. Checks and balances centuries before modern banking. Sure, corruption still happened, but the system was built to resist it, at least most of the time. By sunset, you've marched beside the chest for hours, and you realize something humbling. It's not the swords, the shields, or the eagles that bind this army together. It's the careful math of numbers and trust. Coins, ledgers, and the promise of reward are as sharp a weapon as any pilum. You glance at the chest again. Guards eye you suspiciously. You smile and keep walking. After all, try to touch that chest, and you'll find yourself earning 0 denarii and a very early grave. You wake the next morning to the sound of clanking chains and creaking ox carts, and you realize you're not marching with men today. You're marching with machines. Well, Roman machines, which means wood, iron, rope, and enough brute strength to make modern engineers sweat. If logistics was the nervous system of Rome's military, siege engines were its heavy fists. Mainstream fact: the Romans didn't invent most of their siege engines. They borrowed heavily from the Greeks. But as with everything else, Rome refined them to terrifying efficiency. Catapults, ballistae, battering rams, siege towers, you name it, Rome had a standardized design ready to be shipped with the legion. The genius wasn't just in building them, but in moving them. Picture a ballista the size of a truck rumbling down a Roman road, lashed to wagons, dragged by mules, while soldiers mutter about sore backs. The quirky tidbit: Romans sometimes gave their siege engines nicknames. One inscription refers to a battering ram called Victor. You can almost hear the soldiers joking, "Victor's hungry again, time to feed him some wall." In other cases, graffiti carved on a siege towers mocked the defenders, turning war machines into giant, rolling billboards of smack talk. Think ancient memes, but scarier. Historians still argue whether these machines were primarily tools of terror or practical necessities. Were they designed more to break stone or to break morale? Imagine staring down a 40-foot tower creeping toward your city gates, painted with Roman eagles, while drums thunder in rhythm. Even if you had plenty of arrows, you'd probably feel your courage slip. And the logistics, oh, the logistics. These weren't lightweight IKEA projects. Timber had to be cut, shaped, and assembled. Nails, pitch, and rawhide bindings had to be transported in bulk. Siege engines devoured resources like a teenager devours pizza. Every campaign season meant wagons piled high with spare beams, wheels, ropes, and counterweights. If something broke mid-assault, carpenters swarmed in like a NASCAR pit crew. Without this mobile construction unit, the machines would grind to a halt faster than your laptop without Wi-Fi. You trudge beside one of these beasts now, a giant ballista, its wooden arms creaking, bolts stacked in neat bundles. Soldiers treat it like both a pet and a godsend. When fired, it hurls a massive iron-tipped bolt with the punch of a modern tank round. The sound? A gut-rattling thwack that echoes off valley walls. You imagine some poor defender thinking, well, that's gonna leave a mark, right before the bolt takes out a shield line. And then there are siege towers, rolling fortresses, multi-story wooden beasts covered in hides soaked with vinegar or mud to resist fire. Climbing one feels like boarding an apartment building on wheels. You can't help but wonder how many soldiers actually trusted the rickety planks under their sandals. Yet the Romans made it work time and again. Battering rams were no less impressive. Suspended from chains, capped with iron, and swung with the rhythm of dozens of men, they pounded city gates like an angry landlord demanding rent. Sometimes, defenders dropped flaming barrels or dead animals onto them to stop the attack. The Romans? They just covered the ram in wet hides and kept swinging. Dedication or madness, you decide. But here's the kicker. Transporting siege engines across rivers or mountains required dismantling them piece by piece. Each plank was numbered, every bolt logged, so the machine could be rebuilt on the other side. It's the ultimate flat-pack nightmare, but with a legion of sweaty men to do the lifting. You half expect to hear one grumble. Where's the instruction scroll? Step 3 makes no sense. As evening falls, the machines are arrayed on a hilltop, ready for tomorrow's assault. You watch engineers grease wheels, sharpen bolts, and measure angles with cords and rods. For a moment, the camp feels less like a battlefield and more like a construction site, fused with a carnival of death. And yet, you can't deny it. This logistical ballet is breathtaking. No random mob could field engines like these. Only an empire with discipline, planning, and endless manpower could transform forests into rolling fortresses and wagons into thunder. Tomorrow, walls will fall. Tonight, you marvel at the sheer audacity of Roman engineering. You pull your cloak tighter, shivering, not from cold, but from the realization that even stone walls are no match for paperwork, carpenters, and an army with nothing better to do than knock politely until cities crumble. The night gives way to a haze of smoke and dawn's pale light, and you find yourself standing in the eerie stillness that follows conquest. Siege engines stand abandoned, their ropes sagging, their wheels crusted in mud. The air smells of ash, sweat, and the faint sweetness of trampled vineyards. Around you, Roman soldiers gather their gear with the mechanical rhythm of men who have done this 100 times. The campaign is moving on, and you are carried with it, your feet heavier now than when this journey began. Here lies the last great truth of Roman logistics. Victory wasn't just about taking cities. It was about keeping what was taken. The empire's roads, supply chains, granaries, and workshops all had to extend into the conquered space, weaving it into the Roman world. Soldiers who yesterday swung rams now hammer nails, dig ditches, and stack bricks. A temporary camp transforms into the skeleton of a permanent settlement. Even in triumph, the Roman war machine keeps grinding, never pausing, never allowing loose ends. The quirky tidbit: Romans sometimes issued their soldiers salt as part of payment. Yes, literal salt. From this comes our word salary. Imagine lugging around sacks of seasoning after a hard siege and thinking, great, now I can finally flavor my cabbage. Yet that mundane detail reveals the empire's secret. Soldiers weren't just fighters. They were logistical cogs, each ration and coin tying them deeper into the Roman machine. Historians still argue whether Roman expansion was primarily fueled by military ambition or by the infrastructure that followed conquest. Was it the sword that built the empire, or the road that carried bread and bricks behind the sword? The debate lingers, but walking among these men, you sense the answer is both. The sword cleared the way, but logistics kept the empire alive. As the army marches onward, you notice the traces left behind. The imprint of wagon wheels pressed into the dirt, the outline of a camp that tomorrow will be indistinguishable from farmland, and the silent hulks of siege towers dismantled for timber. Rome consumed everything, repurposed everything, and left behind an invisible web that tied whole provinces into its orbit. The laughter of soldiers rings out faintly. They joke about the next march, about the next fortress that needs convincing. You can almost picture the empire as one endless spreadsheet of columns. How many mules? How many bricks? How much wine per man? And you realize, with a tired smile, that bureaucracy may be the most powerful weapon Rome ever wielded. Now the pace slows, the noise dims, and your steps stretch longer. The chaos of supply trains, the clatter of siege bolts, the rhythm of marching feet, they all soften into a background hum. You picture the empire itself as a living body, the roads as arteries, the camps as beating hearts, and the endless stream of supplies as blood. Without it, everything would collapse in days. With it, Rome thrived for centuries. Your eyes wander over the horizon, where hills fade into blue mist. The war machine trundles onward, but your gaze lingers here in the quiet aftermath, where broken walls still smoke and birds tentatively return to scorched fields. The sharp edges of conquest blur, replaced by a slow, steady weaving of life back into place. And so, you breathe deeper, letting the air settle heavy and calm in your lungs. The frantic march is over. The story has run its course. You no longer hear orders barked or rams crashing. Instead, you hear the whisper of the wind over empty ground. The empire moves on, leaving you behind with its traces, silent roads, scattered coins, salt packed into leather pouches, the faint echo of iron-shod boots fading into history. The Romans built with iron, wood, and sweat, but what they really left was rhythm. The rhythm of carts creaking, of hammers striking, of men laughing as they carried their empire on their shoulders. That rhythm is what you carry now, soft and steady, fading into a lull. So, as the scene dims, let yourself drift with it. No more marches, no more siege towers looming. Only the slow stretch of a horizon, endless and gentle, where history dissolves into memory and memory into silence. You are safe here in the quiet after Rome.